Today, I want to talk about a key principle I try to use in my daily life to make sense of the world and to help me make choices. The idea is simple. Our understanding of anything always happens through models. What we think is real is not necessarily real. We never perceive reality directly. Our brains construct a model of it, a useful simplification of reality. In this video, I will explain why our minds always rely on models, why models are useful, and why they must have blind spots. Once we see this, it becomes obvious that in order to really understand the world, we need to hold our perspectives more lightly, so we can stay flexible about which models we use. Different models help us understand different aspects of reality, but they also have different blind spots. And no matter how many models we use to perceive the same thing, there are always other models we could have used that would allow us to perceive the same thing from a different perspective. So at any moment, our understanding of things is always going to be incomplete. I hope this helps you give you a framework for you to live your life with more epistemic humility, more awareness of our inability to fully know things. And I hope that this will make you more curious and open to new ideas, especially those ideas that don't quite fit how you currently see the world. And once you buy into this point of view, it opens your mind to a lot of things. You start to see the fundamental inadequacy of many of our systems and how much they need to be redesigned to account for the fact that our understanding of the world is always going to be more incomplete than we think it is. So, what do I mean when I say that our brain only understands things through models? What do I mean by model? A model is a useful simplification of reality. I think it is a good idea for me to use an analogy here so we can better understand what a model is. Imagine a one-to-one scale map of the United States. Like 1 inch in the map represents 1 inch in reality. So the map is the size of the whole country. It is a perfectly accurate map. It shows all the details of every single place in the US. It shows my house. It shows the trash can inside this room in my house. But of course, this map is useless. It is just too big to carry around. It contains everything, but it helps you with nothing. So we shrink the map. Think, for instance, of a 1 to 10 million scale map. 1 inch represents the distance of 10 million inches, or about 158 miles. It helps us navigate across the country, moving from one city to another, but it misses all the details inside the cities. Once we arrive in the city, it is difficult for us to go where we need to go. A city in this map is just a dot. So we need to zoom in. We need a map of the city at, say, a 1 to 10,000 scale, where 1 inch represents something like 800 feet. It shows the streets and neighborhoods, so it is helpful to navigate inside the city. But of course, it becomes helpful exactly by omitting some aspects of reality that are not as relevant. It does not show the other cities. It simplifies reality by showing a park, not a specific tree in the park. And it shows a street, not a specific house in that street. Now, if we need to arrive at a specific house, then we need to zoom in even further. We need a map that allows us to separate one house from another house in the same street. That is exactly what GPS apps like Google Maps do. They keep zooming in or zooming out in a fluid way, depending on the details you need. The usefulness comes from shifting scales, not from sticking to a single scale. And that is exactly what models are. They are like maps. They are simplifications of reality that help us navigate the world. This is what I mean when I say every model is like a map. Useful, but partial. They are not a full representation of reality, like the one-to-one map I spoke about. They highlight what matters for the purpose at hand, and they leave out the rest. Models are useful exactly because they are not perfectly accurate. They leave out the details that don't matter at the moment. And because we cannot use a one-to-one map, we must always look at reality partially, through the lens of a model that simplifies reality to make it useful to us. And if we want a more accurate representation of reality, we should always try to sequentially look at more than one type of map. Not only a map at a different scale, but also a map that might highlight different aspects of reality. For instance, Google Maps shows some details like water and roads, but it does not show many other details that are real, like the elevation of the terrain or the landscape around the road. That makes sense when we are driving a car, but if we are hiking, then we would probably want a map that shows the elevation of the terrain and the landscape, right? So just like maps, different models are useful for different situations. There is no single map that works everywhere. And a complete understanding of reality is never possible, in the same way that a one-to-one map is not useful. The best we can do to get closer to a full understanding of reality is by looking at many partial maps, each with their own blind spots, and piecing them together. But that full understanding of reality is always an abstract endpoint. We cannot really arrive there. We can only come closer to it, each time by looking at yet one more model and piecing it together with the other partial models we already have. This point I'm making is grounded in a key idea in philosophy. Any attempt to make sense of the world has to begin with axioms, assumptions that we take for granted, that we accept without proof. That is the starting point that makes progress possible. But any starting point also creates blind spots, because there are always other possible ways of seeing the same thing built on different axioms. That's what I mean with the map analogy. Every map is built on choices about what matters and what doesn't matter. And these choices function like axioms, like starting points that make the map useful. A road map assumes roads are what we care about. A hiking map assumes elevation is what we care about. Each choice makes the map useful in one way, but incomplete in another. And models work the same way. They help us see things, but they also hide. Now, I find this map analogy really helpful, but remember, it's only an analogy. And like any analogy, it can be misleading if taken too literally, which is not what I mean. The point is simply that both maps and models rest on starting assumptions that highlight some things and leave out others. And starting assumptions are always necessary to make the map or the model useful. But the issue is that these assumptions can be wrong. So there is a trade-off. So one way to be less vulnerable to this trade-off is to consider other alternative starting points, alternative axioms, and see if this changes your perspective of things. So, why is it necessary for us humans to use models to understand the world? Why can't we see reality directly, like the one-to-one map? It did not make sense for our ancestors to use their limited resources to perceive all aspects of reality. Some aspects were more important for their survival than others. So the genes that help our ancestors simplify reality in ways that improve survival and reproduction were more likely to be passed on to the next generation. And after many, many generations, here we are. People who tend to perceive only certain aspects of reality. That's why we don't directly observe some things that we now know from science that are real, like infrared light, ultraviolet light, subatomic particles. We also don't perceive sounds and smells that we know other animals can perceive. Bees, for example, see ultraviolet patterns on flowers that guide them to nectar. Snakes detect infrared to find prey at night. Dogs can smell things at concentrations that are thousands of times lower than what we can detect. Those animals build their own kind of model of reality, their own kind of partial map, based on what was useful for their ancestors. And we are not different from them in that way. Our brains evolved to highlight what mattered for survival to our ancestors, not to give us a complete picture of the world. So, that is my perspective. Reality in its totality is beyond our full comprehension. The best we can do is to approach it partially, through models. Models are useful, but they are never complete. For a model to be useful, it has to be incomplete in some way. It has to leave things out, so it can highlight what matters in the moment. And because different models leave out different things, they are useful in different ways, and incomplete in different ways. That is why looking at the same thing from multiple perspectives gives us a better sense of reality. Like maps, every model is partial, and that is why the best we can do is to stay flexible, to hold our models lightly, and to remember that each perspective carries its own blind spots. And if we really care about understanding reality, then it is best to consider different models, different maps. We need sometimes to zoom out, to zoom in, or even to zoom into different features of the map. If you keep this in mind, it changes the way you think completely. It makes you humble because you see that our view is never the whole. There are infinite ways of looking at the same reality, and no useful map can ever give you the full picture. It can never reproduce the one-to-one scale map. It also makes you curious because you start asking what is missing from the maps you are looking at. And it also makes you more empathetic because you recognize that people you disagree with might be looking at a map that shows something true that you cannot see. Now, just to clarify, this doesn't mean that all perspectives are equally valid. Some ideas are simply wrong. My point is that you cannot fairly judge another perspective until you've tried to see the world through their map. And here's the key point. This principle, which justifies epistemic humility, doesn't stop at how we think. It goes further, it changes how we act. For the more important choices in life, it becomes clear that it is wise to look at the same problem from many perspectives, because each point of view highlights something different that could be important, right? It also shows the value of keeping option value, of making tentative choices that leave room to adjust our path as we learn more, instead of locking ourselves into a rigid plan too early. It is like using GPS to drive from New York City to Los Angeles. We don't stick to just one zoom level, right? We switch scales along the way depending on the level of details we need. So far, we've talked about epistemic humility at the personal level. But in the next videos, I want to push this idea further. How should we design our society, our policies, our institutions, even our technologies, knowing that our understanding of the world will never be complete and will always be evolving? If you've seen some of my previous videos, you know I've already started exploring some of these issues, but I plan to delve much deeper into that in future videos. And let me know in the comments if there's a specific topic you'd like me to cover.